This is the Church of Christ at Forest Hill, because I record this, so I'm saying this for YouTube and not for you. We're looking at Luke chapter 21, starting in verse 5. So we've just kind of, sorry, it logged me out of the Google Meets meeting. Hopefully Durwood and Janine are in there waiting. They're not. Okay. So we've covered this thing. We're kind of at the end of a section here. So Jesus has been going around trying to make the leaders, well, it's not right to say he's trying to make people upset, but he is speaking more frankly than he has been about the basically the wrongs, the injustices that they have in their society, which are multi-pronged, right? But basically you have a group of religious elites, particularly in Jerusalem, who are sort of taking advantage of people's genuine piety in order to fleece them. And then not only that, but a lot of them are sort of property holders, and they rent out their places, and they are doing so in predatory ways. So, by the way, most people back then, I don't think people realize this. I think people think that like apartments are a recent thing. But most people back then didn't own lands, but they still lived. A lot of people still lived in cities. So what do? Yes, they had tenements. And they were, just to kind of give you a sense of it, but, so you have these fairly cheaply built wooden buildings, or maybe two, or maybe 3 or 4 stories high, and you'd have 10 to 20 people in an apartment area with animals and no plumbing.
Right, yeah.
So everything goes out in the street, and there's, hundreds of people living in this building. So it's, and then it's owned obviously by somebody else. So it's just an apartment building, but it's like an apartment you would never ever want to live in. So who owns the buildings? Well, people that have the capital to buy them, to raise them, and then they collect the rent. So in Jerusalem, those are the same people as the religious elites. So the people who are in charge of the temple are also like the landlords. See how that? Yeah. So then Jesus comes around and says, woe to you who like to go around with long robes, like the chief priest, and be greeted in the marketplaces, have the best seats in the synagogues, place of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses. Right? So it's a very sharp critique of this this alignment of really kind of pride, religious pride, with very unjust day-to-day business practices that harm the least of these. And then, as if on cue, who comes out but the widow and her 2 mites, as like an example of that, that genuine piety that's being taken advantage of. So, notice Jesus doesn't tell them, do what she does. She's not put forward as an example. She's put forward not as an example for them to imitate. She's put forward as an example of exploitation. Yeah. So Jesus is certainly not knocking her genuine, faith. But the point of the whole episode is to say, look at this genuine faith and look at how her religious leaders are treating her. And we've gone through the law. We went through Deuteronomy. It's pretty bad, right? It's pretty bad. And I think it's Exodus 34:34. God says, if you mistreat the widows and the orphans, I will come and I will kill you and make your wives widows and your children orphans.
Yeah.
So it's God's very serious about this in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Right? And these are the teachers of the law, right, who are mistreating widows and orphans. Okay, so that's the end of that section, and it's kind of Jesus's final call to repentance. It's a sort of prophetic word to the people in power in Jerusalem. And I've pointed this out a few times. It was worth saying because we're at the end of this kind of part of the story. But Jesus saves his harshest criticisms for the people that have the most responsibility for the way that the society works, for the people that have the most power. And now he's at the center of power in Palestine with Roman power, but he saves it mostly for the religious authorities. And it's really quite devastating. Yeah, okay. So, but before we kind of get into the rest of it, I'm going to see if y'all have any thoughts, or because we really are moving into a different section here.
I guess what I was thinking about how rich she is in God's sight compared to them. To them, you know, they have their reward now, but she's gonna get hers and better.
Yeah.
In my mind, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, it's like that reminds me of this when you say that the scripture that says, "Store up your
treasures.
treasures in heaven."
Right.
You know, and like you said, that's what basically she's
Yeah,
doing.
she's doing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But there's still the problem of what she's going to do at the end of the day to eat.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody's around to solve that for her. Even though they should be.
Right.
Right?
They know the law.
She should be going to those same people and getting something back, and instead they're taking from her, right?
Mm-hmm.
And not so that they can eat, but so that they can have fancy clothes and stuff.
Yeah.
You know. So they're taking what she needs to live in order to sort of enhance their already pretty nice lifestyle.
But they better enjoy it.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that's it. That's all we're getting.
That's all we're getting. Unless you repent.
Okay, so yeah, which is possible, right? Because we had that with
The rich, no, not the rich.
I'm sorry, I'm blanking on his name, Zacchaeus.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so
Oh, yeah.
it's not a Jesus. When there's so many widows and orphans and poor people running around, Jesus has a sort of raised eyebrow for all of the rich guys.
Mm-hmm. What are you doing?
Yeah. But he's not. He doesn't hate them as a group. There's always this kind of openness for people to be other than what they are right that moment. Right? So that's always possible. So it's not as harsh as it is. There's always that openness, to be received again. Okay, so yes.
The best part for me was back, like in verse 27 and down, where he's having a discussion with the Sadducees, and they're obviously trying to trap him.
Mm-hmm.
And down in verse 40, and no one dared to ask him any more questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, mic drop.
Okay. Well, I'm trying to think about how to break up the next little section, but Faye, would you read? Let's say let's just say 5 and 6, and then we'll have somebody read for a long time.
Okay. Signs of the end of the age. Some of his disciples were remarking about how the temple was adorned with beautiful stone and with gifts dedicated to God. But Jesus said, as for what you see here, the time will come when not one stone will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down.
Okay, so this just kind of sets the scene. But they're still in the temple complex. Okay, so they haven't left. They're just sitting around and making the Sadducees and the priests and stuff upset. But the disciples, yeah, you have to remember. So they're from they're not like complete peasants, rustics, but they are. Their idea of a town is maybe like 3,000 people or something like that. That's a fairly big city. That's like Capernaum. Nazareth is like 400. So even at what they would think of as a city, there are no big buildings. And so the temple in Jerusalem was like 200 feet tall. So if you can imagine what that would be like. I mean, that's the biggest building, for a long way away. It's probably the biggest building they'd ever seen in their lives. And so they're amazed by it, right? It's so big, like there's so much stuff here. Where did all this wealth come from? All in one spot. It's a sort of, you can see how they would be amazed. They got the tourist sort of gaze going on, right? That was something I became familiar with when we lived in D.C. But there were, at first you are a tourist when you first get there, and then you're sort of annoyed with the tourists. But that's all they're doing. They're just walking around, and they're like, "Wow, it's so big." You get annoyed with them because they don't know how the metro works, and so you're supposed to go in, and then the people go out, or the people go out, and then you go in, and then they would try to go in while the people are going out. Stop doing that.
But when you first got there, that's the way you were, right?
I know. I know. It doesn't. I know. It just, you can't help the way you feel in the moment. And that was only a problem on like days when there were big events. Okay, so we're going to read a big long section here. And I think, but that's all you got to know. So they're very deeply impressed with the temple. Everything kind of centers around the temple in Jerusalem. It's very important that you remember that, and that you remember that specifically like the geography of this, or you won't really get what the rest of the section is about. It's about the temple in Jerusalem. So,
just because it's so impressive.
Yeah, that's what occasions it. And then when you know a little bit more, and we'll kind of go through this, the historical context of it, it becomes very clear that that's what it's about. Okay, but you might be tempted to think it's about other things. So, Cam, would you mind reading this long section?
No, I don't mind.
Okay, I guess it's 9 through.
You didn't get to 9.
We didn't do 7 yet.
7 through what?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, 7. You're right. 7 through.
37?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay.
Whoa.
Teacher, they asked, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign that they are about to take place? He replied, watch out that you are not deceived, for many will come in my name, claiming, I am he, and the time is near. Do not follow them. When you hear of wars and revolutions, do not be frightened. These things must happen first, but the end will come right away.
Will not come.
Will not come, but the end will not come right away. What important negative there, yeah. The end will not come right away. Then he said to them, nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, famines, and pestilence in various places, and fearful events and great signs from heaven. But before all this, they will lay hands on you and persecute you. They will deliver you to synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors, and all on account of my name. This will result in your being witnesses to them. But make up your mind not to worry beforehand how you will defend yourselves. For I will give you words and wisdom that none of your adversaries will be able to resist or contradict. You will be betrayed even by parents, brothers, relatives, and friends, and they will put some of you to death. All men will hate you because of me, but not a hair of your head will perish. By standing firm, you will gain life. When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those in the city get out, and let those in the country not enter the city, for this is the time of punishment in fulfillment of all that has been written. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. There will be great distress in the land and wrath against this people. They will fall by the sword and will be taken as prisoners to all the nations. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. There will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars. On the earth, nations will be in anguish and perplexity in the roaring and tossing of the sea. Men will faint from terror, apprehensive of what is coming on the world, for the heavenly bodies will be shaken. And that time they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. When these things begin to take place, stand up and lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. He told them this parable. Look at the fig tree and all the trees. When they sprout leaves, you can see for yourselves and know that summer is near. Even so, when you see these things happening, you know that the kingdom of God is near. I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Be careful, or your hearts will be weighed down with dissipation, drunkenness, and anxieties of life, and that day will close on you unexpectedly like a trap. For it will come upon all those who live on the face of the whole earth. Be always on the watch and pray that you may be able to escape all that is about to happen, and that you may be able to stand before the Son of Man. Each day Jesus was teaching at the temple, and each evening he went out to spend the night on the hill called the Mount of Olives. And all the people came early in the morning to hear him at the temple.
Okay, so yeah, it's a bit of a long section. It'll kind of record, but the best way to do it is to kind of, I'll make some comments about it as a whole, but because it is kind of one piece. So let me give you kind of a timeline of some things that happen after Jesus' death, okay? So we kind of know the New Testament events. So you have Jesus was crucified probably sometime around 26 or 27. He was probably born, somewhere around, he was not born in 0. So 26 or 27. And then Paul starts running around in the 40s, okay, and dies in the early 50s. Now, between that time and we'll say 67 or so, that the whole book of Acts happens, in that time, between 27 and 54, something like that. Now, after that happens, after 54 and into the 60s, you have an emperor named Nero, who's a disaster, just a human disaster, and just he's a terrible, terrible emperor. He's very, very incompetent, very violent, loves to perform. We talked about this a little bit last time.
Yeah.
He wanted, his greatest aspiration was not to become emperor, but to become a famous actor, and he wanted to use his role as emperor to sort of launch his acting career. And eventually people got tired of it. So they killed him in 68, and then that year you had 4 emperors. 1 year.
Okay.
So if you want to read Tacitus, the histories, that gives you, it's actually, for an ancient history, it's very kind of gripping. But there's a period of time in 68 when you have several different emperors, and at the end of it, you have a guy named Vespasian who's off fighting the war in Judea against the Judeans who've decided to rebel, and he's taking little hill forts on his way to Jerusalem to destroy it, and he has to go to Rome to take over and become emperor. And his son actually takes the city of Jerusalem in 70 AD and destroys it, and destroys the temple. That's Titus Vespasian. Okay, so keeping that kind of timeline in mind, and bear in mind, Luke was written after all of this occurred.
Okay.
Okay, that's what most scholars think. It was written sometime, maybe 80, maybe about 10 years after Jerusalem was destroyed. So when Jesus has just said, there will be a time when all of these stones are not even, there won't be one left standing. The temple will be destroyed. That's the point of what he's saying. There'll be a time when not one stone will be left on another. They're freaking out. What does that mean? What do you mean? When's the temple going to be destroyed? That's the question he's answering.
Okay.
So what he goes on to talk about, basically, when you hear of wars and insurrections, don't be terrified. These things must take place, but the end will not follow immediately. So when you have people show up claiming to be the Messiah and starting a revolution, don't get too worried about it. That's not the end of the world. Literally, not the end of the world. In other words, the day of judgment's not going to happen because of that. Now, bear in mind, that's what everybody else would have thought.
Yeah.
Remember their expectations for Jesus.
Right.
Think about, you're an average Jew in Judea. Jesus comes around, people kill him, you move on with your life, but your expectations are the same. So you're still expecting,
Still waiting for the Messiah.
still expecting the
For the militant Messiah.
militant Messiah to show up, and when he does and kicks the Romans out, then the day of the Lord will have arrived, the end times will have come, and so on. That's still their expectation. So Jesus is saying there's going to be a rebellion a little bit down the line. When that happens, don't freak out. It's not the end of the world.
Right.
And its nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. And he's, in a very oblique way, he's talking about 68. You have 4 emperors. You had 3 civil wars in the Roman Empire in 1 year. Yeah, it was a really, and if you read Tacitus, there are tons and tons of mentions of omens and sort of strange animals doing strange things and strange weather events and earthquakes and stuff like that. Okay. So that's what he's talking. He's talking about that. He's talking about a very specific moment in time. Okay. He's talking about this really crazy year when you have 3 emperors. Okay. But he says, but look, okay, here's the important thing. This is what I want you to focus on. I want you to focus on what you're going to be doing between now and then, which is you're going to be spreading the gospel to the Gentiles, and the Jews. You're going to go preach the gospel. You're going to go do the whole Book of Acts thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a little version of the Book of Acts. Is basically 12 through 19. And remember, Luke wrote Acts. So this is his little kind of get ready for Acts. Okay. But everything that happens in Acts happens before the year of the 4 emperors. Right?
Okay.
That all happens before that. So he's kind of going in order, saying, there's all this big stuff coming. Focus on what you're going to be doing during the Book of Acts. After that, then you have Jerusalem surrounded by armies. That's Vespasian. When you see the city surrounded by armies, don't listen to the people who believe they have the Messiah, okay, who think that they're going to be fine. they're going to win because God's on their side. Jesus is saying, you are in a very, that's actually when you're in danger. Get out. Like, leave Jerusalem. Don't stay.
Yeah.
They will not win. That's what he's saying. The Gentiles are going to win. Now, this is like not at all what the Messiah is supposed to be saying at
Yeah.
all.
Yeah.
Right? But that is what he's saying. So he's, and remember, there's a large Jewish community in Jerusalem. I mean, I'm sorry, a large Jewish Christian community in Jerusalem.
Oh, okay.
Get out.
Yeah.
Don't stay.
Out of Jerusalem.
Yeah, leave. Right? Remember, James was the big wig among the Christians in Jerusalem. So get out, leave, go somewhere else. Things are not going to go well. So he's giving them actually a very practically, very practical warning. Get out of
Would they
Dodge.
have understood what he was saying?
Yes.
Telling them the future.
Yeah, because even here he's not being particularly mysterious. Just like, when you see an army besieging the city, leave. Because there's a chance when the Romans show up to besiege a city, they encircle it and they say, leave or stay. If you stay, we'll kill you. You'll be the people that leave.
Yeah.
Did he tell them to leave before that happened?
Yeah. Leave now, or leave preferably
Go
before.
while the getting's good.
Right. Yeah, because that seems obvious, but remember, everybody else around believes that the Messiah has come and that they're going to whip the Romans. Now, unfortunately, what actually happened when this occurred was that they had kind of more than one lot. They had several different groups who then began to fight a civil war amongst each other while the Romans were besieging the city. And there was as much as, according to Josephus, who was not always super accurate, but he said it was as violent within the city as without. So.
Isn't
Wow.
the destruction of Jerusalem around 70 AD, isn't that mark sort of the demarcation between the church and the synagogue?
It's a big event for both. It's not exactly. It's a big event for both in different ways. For Christianity, it sort of it cuts them off from a very important historic connection to Judaism, which is the temple. For the Jews too, it uprooted them. They never had a temple again after that, and so then they had to center their devotion around the study of Torah, which they had already begun to do because of the diaspora. Right? They'd already been spread around. So they are already practically, if you're a Jew living in Spain, are you going to come back to the temple for Passover?
What was the impetus for the diaspora?
Well, this wasn't the first time that Gentiles came and took Jerusalem, right? So the Assyrians came and wiped out the 10 tribes. That was the first diaspora. And then the Babylonians came in and did it again and took Judah, and spread them out again. And so there were big populations in Alexandria and in Egypt. A lot of Jews in Rome. But they kind of spread out all over the Mediterranean, and then, as far east as India. They went a long way. I mean, but if you think of it like this, first it's really just like there are lots of diasporas. There's not just a Jewish diaspora, but there's
that word is just.
So it comes from the Greek word for like sowing a field. But there are groups of people, that are in one place, and then they're spread out.
Okay,
So I'll give you a couple examples so there's the Jewish diaspora, and they're spread out, right? There's the Celtic diaspora. Okay, so there are Celtic peoples that live in Scotland, Ireland, parts of northern France, the United States, right? And there's the African diaspora. So African people with African roots in the United States, Jamaica, the Caribbean, all over the world, right? So and if you think about it, like those are good examples because they show the different people can be forcibly taken, as the Jews were, from one place to another, and then they can move again after that for other reasons. So there's the first kind of, they were forcibly removed, the Jews were forcibly removed, but then, maybe they were merchants or they did other things, and then they went, where there were opportunities. So, why are there Jews in the United States, right? Nobody forcibly took them there, but that's where opportunities were. Right? Okay. So what this passage is up to here, right, up to 24, it's really about, we're laying out a story of what are we going to do until the temple's destroyed. And it's Jesus basically saying to the guys whose whole religious focus had really centered around the temple, he's telling them, stop that. The temple's not even going to be around, like, very soon. Maybe not within your lifetime, but within your contemporaries' lifetimes. It's going to be gone. And it's a big deal. Like, it's a big deal for everybody, even Christians. Even though they had kind of, in some ways moved on, it's still, it holds this sort of place in their imagination. And Jesus spends, even for Jesus, like, he spends a lot of time there. A lot of things in Luke happen at the temple. And where do they start out in Acts? Where do they start meeting? You remember? In Jerusalem? In the temple. Solomon's portico. Why?
Yeah, that's where Peter's speech was.
Yeah. Why? Why do they do that? Like, what's the?
It's the gathering place.
Yeah.
Where people naturally would come.
Yeah, it's something about the temple. It still has a hold on them. I listened to a story that was told by. It's actually a guy who's a philosopher, and he's like he's like a straight up atheist, but his wife is a sort of lapsed Catholic, and he was telling a story about how he was a Cub Scout master in the basement, and they were having in the basement of a Catholic church, and his two like secular. His like family is Jewish, but he's like a Marxist atheist, and so his children were like wandered upstairs, and he finished up with what he was doing and walked up there, and they were in line to get like communion, and so he saw them, he was about to grab them to take them out of line, but then he was sort of like, there's no God, so who cares? Like, it doesn't matter. And think about it in his mindset, right? Like, it's well, whatever. Like, it would be more of a ruckus for him to go grab the kids than it would be just let them go through. That's what he's thinking. So he goes home and he tells his wife and he says, our boys received Holy Communion this evening, and she was aghast. Why is she aghast? She's not religious anymore, but she'd grown up Catholic, and that whole thing, the Holy Communion, somebody receiving it when they're not in the church, she couldn't. So there was this thing in her that it had a hold, an imaginative and sort of affective hold. It hit her in her heart, And the temple's like that even for Christians.
Well, they consider themselves to be Jews at this point. They didn't.
Well, they're all Jews.
Yeah.
Everybody he's talking to right here is a Jew. So it's well, they wouldn't have even consider themselves lapsed Jews. They would just say, I'm a Jew who follows Jesus.
Okay.
Right. So Paul goes and makes sacrifices and stuff. So they're not thinking about it like that. But so in a certain way, he's trying to soften the blow on that, and he's also trying to help them not to make what really is like a political mistake. So in other words, when these guys come around saying that they're going to inaugurate the end times, don't believe them. It's really important that you don't go in for this. These guys don't know what they're talking about. They're going to come around saying, I'm the new David, and I'm coming around to establish this kingdom and to bring God's glory and to bring about the day of judgment. Don't fall for it. Saying, you just keep plugging along, right? Telling people about the gospel. Just do that. Ignore the other stuff. When the Romans show up, leave. Right? And you could see about, so what's this doing in Luke, right? If it's written after the fact. Because it's not new, because like you're living 10 years after this has happened, you're going to read it and be like, I know exactly what that's about. Right? That's about the temple, because you know about the events. It's far enough away that everybody's heard the details by this point, but it's close enough that everybody remembers the details. Right? So everybody's going to know that's what this is about. Okay. What do you think? Why does it matter that Luke, included this? Because there's a lot of stuff Jesus said, and maybe some of it, was like, don't go to that meeting next week, right? Which might have been urgent for so-and-so at the time, but is not included because it's no longer important, right?
Jesus had given them the warning.
Why does that matter?
Because nobody knew what was going to happen, but Jesus did.
Yeah. There's something important about him being able to predict events. That's going to come up in the rest.
And it'll save their lives.
Yeah. That's true. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. So it's a theme that this is a theme that pops up in the Passion Week. So remember when Jesus said, you go and grab a colt and everything will be where it's supposed to be. He's going to say that, and then in a little bit he's going to say, follow a guy who's carrying a jug on his head. And there's a lot of predictions that he makes. They all come true. So this kind of falls in with that. And it is there to enhance his authority. I mean, it is there for the audience, to enhance for the audience their understanding of his authority.
So that really gives them a picture, basically, not only of the miracles that he performed, but the things that he knew was going to happen.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Okay. Now the stuff that happens after that, I mean, we could stop with that, talk about all the details, but the stuff about women that are nursing, women that are pregnant. He's talking about siege, and he's talking about women who are nursing and pregnant have to eat a lot, and you can't eat a lot during a siege. And it's hard to travel, so that's why he says it. He's not saying he's not hating on them, but he's saying like it's a terrible thing to be in a siege as a pregnant or nursing woman, right? So leave. The next little thing from 25 on, that is about end times. Okay, so the other stuff, it's important. Like the stuff before that is not. It's about the Jerusalem siege. Yeah. So the reason I'm pausing about this is because I wouldn't have to do this if there wasn't such a thing as YouTube, but there are so many people on YouTube who make their YouTube bucks giving bizarre readings of the Bible in which they predict the end time will be,
July 3rd.
July 3rd. Not going to make it to Independence Day. Yeah, we're... So it's and so I kind of harp on that. What he actually says, when in the Bible they really talk, and it's really clear they're talking about the end times, there are no details. It's incredible how vague this is, right? He says there will be signs in the sun and the moon and the stars and the earth and among the nations and blah blah blah, right? But he doesn't say what the signs are. Yeah, I mean,
like he's saying, you'll know.
Yeah.
When these things start to happen.
Yeah. I mean, it's and the thing that's probably the toughest for people to understand in this is when he says, "Truly, I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all things have taken place." It's kind of weird because, on the face of it, that seems to be obviously false. Because they're all, everybody who's around, everybody except for Jesus in the scene is dead.
Yeah.
Everybody in the whole world is dead and buried, except Jesus. He's the only one, right? Now, my favorite creative interpretation of this is that Jesus is in that generation, and therefore, he has not passed away. He's alive and at the right hand of the Father. Therefore, that generation has not passed away. Can't be denied, right? But kind of, doesn't feels maybe too creative as an interpretation. The other one is that Jesus is just wrong, and that early Christians thought he was going to come back really soon, and he didn't. So that's one that I'm giving you options here, right? Yeah, I mean, I think that might have been what Luke thought. That might have been what Luke thought when he wrote it down. It's entirely possible. I don't know. Those are the two interpretations that I think are. But that's kind of tough, I think, for Christians to say. In this section that's really about Jesus knowing what he's talking about, that Jesus doesn't know what he's talking about.
Is there any wiggle room in the translation?
No, not really.
Okay.
Yeah, I thought about that too. I mean, it's just generation is just like it is just the people that are born. This coterie of people who are born. The people who are around right now.
Is there any possibility that this verse came up here before verse 25?
That would be
So
nice.
that when he says all these things,
he means the other stuff.
the other stuff.
That could be right. It depends on what the word "all" means, and could it be somewhat constricted?
Because it simply isn't possible that Jesus is wrong.
Right.
So we have to start from there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean that's yeah, no, I mean I don't have problems with that, but yeah, I mean I think it's, without moving it around, it could be that he's just talking about the Jerusalem siege, and that the other stuff hasn't come. I mean, it hasn't come around.
No,
Right.
it doesn't.
Or it could be that the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and glory. And this is another interpretation that I saved for last, but it's about his crucifixion. So let me read it and see if this works, because that's kind of the crux of it, right? Like that's the thing that's hard to square. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now when these things begin to take place, stand up and raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. Now I would remind you, I mean, you could read the rest of it, but on Golgotha there are signs. I mean, like the sun goes dark and there is a cloud, and that is when redemption draws near, and the Son of Man does descend in a certain way. And that could be what he means. And in that sense, then it's not none of the stuff in here at all is about the end times, if that's the case. If that's a way you can read it.
And the bottom line is, all of the above may be in error too.
Yeah.
And we just don't know.
It could be, yeah. Yeah.
We're trying to put handles on this.
And
Well, it's supposed to mean something, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
and would Jesus give away what it's going to be like at the end?
Yeah, I mean, he no, pretty
No.
much no.
No.
They just don't. No, I mean, nobody in any of the Bible ever comes around and says anything very clear about that stuff. They're very like they use very it's not vague is not the right word, but they use a lot of symbols and narratives and
Colorful language.
colorful language, and yeah, I mean um, I personally I like the crucifixion interpretation of those verses, um, because in a way, um, the crucifixion and the resurrection, it's not just Jesus coming back from the dead, but the way the New Testament portrays it is a it's a sort of it's sort of like the end times bursting into today. You know, it's a sort of ripping apart of the present and the entrance of the end times. Um, and so in that sense, there is no like Christ is the apocalypse. He is like the apocalypse in his ministry. He is in the true sense of that word. He is the revelation of God in his life, you know, and the church in that sense is apocalyptic. Like so the way that we have it, where it's sort of like there's normal time and then you know the apocalypse, and that's a different thing. That's not the way the New Testament portrays it. It's like the that time and this time are starting to intermingle in this bizarre way, and so that's why Jesus jumps around, you know, potentially in time. So for them, it really is presented. I mean, the crucifixion is presented as an explosion of the end times into our own time. Very hard to wrap your head around.
Yeah.
Um, it's a little judge. I mean, it's like a couple hours of Judgment Day, and then like 40 days. I mean, it's anyway. Um, so
But when we talk about end times, you can look at that more than one way. I mean, the end time could be a short period of time before the world ends, or it can be the period of time between when Jesus came and the end of the world, which is way out there. But that whole time is considered to be the end time.
yeah, I mean that's one way that people try to square that too. I think
Because, you know, they would have read this and said, oh, it's coming right up, you know.
Right.
No, it's been 2,000 years.
yeah,
I mean,
Right.
how many more thousand years may it be, but it'll still be the end time.
yeah. I mean, Paul really thought it was going to be like tomorrow, but
Yeah.
he was wrong about
But
that.
the point is,
but-
when it comes for each of us, that's the end time.
Oh well, that's true. That's true.
So,
I mean, it's even the way that we talk about end times is really like I don't know if it's even a very very helpful, but I've started to move more into the language of apocalypse because if you can clarify it, then it can be helpful. But it is, but what we look forward to, there will be a judgment day, and at that time there is sort of an unveiling, right? But it's not the end of the world, but it's a world in which God's presence is unveiled, right? Where we see God face to face. So if you, according to that metaphor, our existence right now, God is veiled, so to speak. The face of God is veiled. And the thing that really matters is not that time has come to an end, but that the sort of way the world exists has changed. You know, that the world is transfigured. To think about the story of the transfiguration, right? Everything changes when you see God's face.
yeah, I've always thought that when the Bible talks about a new heaven and a new earth, It isn't necessarily talking about a different heaven and a different earth.
Yes, that's right. That's exactly right. Yes. In fact, it's not. I think it's not. Yeah. I mean,
It's
Jesus,
a renewed heaven
right.
and a renewed earth.
Jesus's body is still his body. It just does it exists differently,
Mhm.
but it's the same body, right? Otherwise, it's not Jesus, right? And so it's so that's one of the ways too. Like speaking in isn't quite right because it's not like there's not going to be anything going on, you know. In a certain way, it'll be like there's more going on than has ever gone on, right? So it's very hard to talk about, but it's possible that's what he means. In other words, to kind of circle back around, it's possible that he just means he's talking about his crucifixion, and that the sort of unveiling of God's face and the world changing its way of being because of that sort of grows out of the soil of Golgotha. That the whole thing comes out of this sort of crack in the universe that happens right there. Okay, so we've gotten a little science fiction-y, but we'll have to kind of stop there.
Well, the one thing, can I just say, the one thing that I'm seeing that takes me back to the day he ascended is verse 27, when he says, "At that time they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory." And at his ascension, it was said that he would return the same way as he left.
Right.
So
Yeah, I think that there's a connection with the ascension for sure. The only reason I think it's crucifixion more than resurrection is because hold your head up, your redemption is near.
right.
And they don't tend to think of the ascension as like it's important. It's actually very important. We can talk about it when we get there, but that's really where adoption is like finalized for us, is the ascension. But redemption is really about the cross. You know, it's really,
Oh, yeah.
you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
But again, like for them, the whole thing kind of like it all kind of runs together.
Yeah.
They don't totally want to pull it all. It all matters, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we'll have to stop there. So let's go ahead and pray. Lord, we thank you for the good things you've given to us. We thank you for our church. We thank you for the Gospel of Luke. We thank you for those who contributed to it. We thank you for the author. We thank you for everybody who copied it out. We thank you for the many, many generations of Christians who have taught it to one another and gained insight and passed those on, and little insights that we carry with us even though we don't even realize that they came from somebody else. We thank you for Jesus's love for us in his deep sense, and the fact that he communicates this, that the decisive elements of history are already written, and that however the world may look, we have really a pretty simple job to do, which is to tell the truth about your love for us, and to imitate that, and help us to do that here now where we live in little ways, and not to worry too much about claims that people make about the end of the world or anything like that. Help us to be faithful to you and give us wisdom and insight. And we pray that you would watch over those who are sick, those who are mourning, and bring us back together for worship this Sunday. And in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Sorry about my. Sorry about my.
That was Janine,
Oh, was it?
'cause
Okay.
she just called me.
Okay.
For
Yeah.
timing.
Oh, okay. I'll have to call her back here in a second.
Let me call her right now.
He needs to get out of here.
Hey, Janine.